Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to sleep disorders, and dreaming. That is our topic of discussion for this particular area of material. Why, you might ask, would we be talking about such things in the middle of our biopsychology chapter, which is all about brain structure and function? Well, the answer is that when we sleep and dream, those are just some slightly altered forms of our waking consciousness, and our brain is the one behind the different things that are happening during these different levels of consciousness, if you will. So, we're going to take a peek at some of those different ways of existing that aren't full on waking consciousness as part of this particular section of information. I think that you'll find it really interesting. It's fascinating to think about what's happening in our bodies during the night when we're slightly more disconnected from the world around us, but still conscious, right? And we're also going to look at some different theories that seek to explain why we dream the things that we do. So, all of that is to come for us. Let's start out first, though, by just talking about some slight variations in waking consciousness. Okay, so waking consciousness has to do with any time that you're literally alert and awake and as fully engaged as possible with the environment around you. So as we move through different variations of consciousness throughout the day, because we're never staying in just a static version of consciousness, psychologists look at something called our circadian rhythm. And your circadian rhythm is a 24-hour cycle that your body goes through, where throughout the day, more than 100 different bodily processes rhythmically kind of peak and dip to influence how awake and alert, how hot or cold, how worked up or not you happen to be. Now, our circadian rhythm, you can kind of see a visual of it up in the left-hand corner there. It's basically happening behind the scenes, and we don't tend to think about our circadian rhythm very much unless it gets thrown off by some particular way. And so for any of you who have traveled and experienced jet lag, or for any of you maybe who have parents who work uh, the graveyard shift or the night shift, where you work all night and sleep during the day, as opposed to a more traditional work schedule, you will have a sense of your circadian rhythm being a little bit off. So typically, our circadian rhythms develop around the sun. When the sun rises, it cues this sequence of events to happen in our bodies. And when the sun sets, it also cues a sequence of events having our bodies calm down and relax a little bit. But when we travel, then our body is on one rhythmic cycle, one 24-hour cycle. And when we move to a new space, it's a little bit off. And that can lead to some really interesting physiological and mental issues like reduced concentration, increased fatigue. If any of you have been really jet lagged, your eating feels off, you feel a little bit sick to your stomach or not hungry, things like that. Age and life experience can also alter our circadian rhythm. At age 20, we start to shift more toward a morning orientation than an evening orientation. And so you hopefully read some interesting things in your book about morning people versus night people. Some people naturally, their 24-hour cycles cause them to wake really easily and happily super early in the morning. They just pop out of bed, they're ready to go. Those would be morning people, and they get really sleepy around 3 p.m. and then they kind of get their second wind and then they go to bed a little bit earlier at night. Whereas true night people, they wake up really in a lot of difficulty in the morning. They're sleepy and groggy. They don't want to get up. And then at nighttime, they really just kind of come alive and have all this energy. So some of those rhythms vary genetically, but they also kind of vary in particular patterns given the age that you are. Interestingly, probably almost none of you identify as morning people right now because teenagers tend to biologically turn into night people for a little bit. So you probably very much like to sleep in a little bit longer in the morning and stay up later at night talking with your friends. So that's just a little bit of information around circadian rhythms in general when we're in waking consciousness. Now let's talk a little bit about sleep. Sleep is fascinating. Psychologists, we know that we need to sleep to survive. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Most psychologists believe we actually even need to dream, that there's some biological function of dreaming that's healthy for us that we need to do. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute as well. But when we talk about research related to sleeping, you might be thinking, well, how could you possibly do research about people when they're asleep and they're not awake to be able to tell you what's going on with them? One way that we study sleep is using that window into the brain that we learned about last time, the EEG. And so, a really common way to study sleep is you can sign up to be part of a sleep study where you go into a hospital and you volunteer to stay there for 24 hours overnight. And when it's time for you to go to bed, you put on an EEG cap. It's actually super comfortable. It's kind of like a shower cap. And there's electrodes located all around the cap that are going to measure your brain waves when you sleep during the night. So then you just lay down and you try to fall asleep as normal. And while you're sleeping, then the EEG is monitoring and outputting what your brain is doing so that psychologists can research, what's happening as these people sleep through the night. And so through a ton of sleep studies where we look at EEG as our data, we know that sleep consists of a repeating pattern of distinct stages that we cycle into and out of throughout the night. So we're going to talk in this next section about what does each distinct stage of sleep look like? And how do we put those all together to see what a typical night's sleep looks like as we cycle into and out of these various stages? Okay. So here we go. In general, before we look at the specific stages of sleep in the sleep cycle, just want to be aware that there's two overall types of sleep: REM sleep and non-REM sleep. Okay. REM stands for rapid eye movement. And REM sleep refers to what we call active sleep, in which the sleeper's eyes literally dart back and forth behind their closed eyelids. This type of sleep is the sleep that we're in when we're dreaming. And we cycle into and out of REM stages of sleep that get longer in duration as the night goes on. Okay. This is often called paradoxical sleep because when your body goes into REM sleep during the night, you're externally calm. In fact, your body actually voluntarily paralyzes you, which is super adaptive if you think about it, because think about some of the craziest dreams that you've ever had. It's really good that your body doesn't just get up while you're sleeping and act all of that out. That would actually be super dangerous. And there are people where their internal mechanism that self-paralyzes is not working correctly, and they have severely injured themselves. There's some really interesting stories that I'll tell you in class next time related to what happens when that mechanism isn't quite working correctly for you. And so it's called paradoxical sleep because your body is calm and it's not moving, but your brain waves actually really closely resemble your brain waves during waking consciousness. That's REM sleep, okay? Then we also have non-REM sleep, non-rapid eye movement sleep, and this is considered to be quiet sleep. This is associated with times during the night when your brain waves have actually slowed substantially down, and those are divided into some additional non-REM stages of sleep that we'll look at together now. Okay, before we dive into the sleep stages, again, because we're talking about the brain, this whole chapter is all about the brain and how it controls our body, and especially here in different types of consciousness. And so, want to be familiar with the good old hypothalamus, the llamas. Remember that special video that we watched in class last time? But the hypothalamus in general controls bodily functions, right? It keeps the body in homeostasis. And specifically within the hypothalamus is the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And this is thought to be concerned with the regulation of our physiological circadian rhythms, our sleepiness and our wakefulness. Okay. So now let's dive into these sleep stages and look at what a typical sleep cycle looks like throughout the night. So imagine that you're climbing into your bed at night, you're just getting ready to fall asleep. If you look at the yellow rectangle up on the screen here, That's what your brain waves look like during waking consciousness. So you can imagine, like, as you kind of climb into bed, lay down, start to disconnect from the stress of the day, all the activities that you've been doing, your brain waves look like that. Really tiny and crammed together, lots of energy happening. You're thinking, you're processing, you're doing all of these things. And then eventually, as you close your eyes, it signals to your body, okay, it's time for me to slow down a little bit and to relax. And so you go into this really sort of relaxed state initially where you're not all the way asleep, but you're also not fully awake. And so you can see how, as your brain moves from beta waves of waking consciousness to alpha waves associated with just that really nice twilight state where you're kind of connected to reality, kind of not so much, your brainwaves slow down a little bit. You start to lose total connection with conscious reality. Fun fact for you, when you yawn, it actually creates a boost in alertness while your brain is trying to slow down. And so once you yawn a couple times, then hopefully you get that out of your system and don't continue to yawn, kind of get that out of the way. Your breathing slows down, your brain waves become slower and less regular. And then eventually your brain waves change from alpha waves into stage 1, a little bit more relaxed waves. So here's kind of a chart, you guys, about what happens in these different stages that you cycle into and out of during the night. Let's talk about each stage, and then we'll combine those together so you can see what a cycle looks like throughout the night. So again, you're just sort of starting to fall asleep. You go into non-REM stage 1. Your brain waves are alpha waves. They're a little bit less connected to reality than those beta waves. This first stage only lasts about 5 to 10 minutes, and you're sort of alert, sort of aware, like I mentioned, but you're really slowly kind of crossing into that deeper stage of sleep, which is stage 2. And stage 2 is characterized by theta waves, brain waves. Those are even slower in frequency than the alpha waves. And stage 2 lasts about 20 minutes during the night. This is where you are genuinely asleep, but you probably could be awakened without too much difficulty. So I don't know if this ever happens to you, but if you've kind of just gone to bed at night and maybe you hear your mom call to your dad, or somebody brings laundry into your room to put away, and you immediately kind of wake up and respond to that, that would be an example of how responsive you would be in stage 2 sleep. Okay, eventually then you move all the way into the delta stage of sleep, where your brain waves are the most disconnected from reality. And this stage lasts about 30 minutes. We call this deep sleep or restorative sleep. This is where your muscles truly relax, your blood pressure and breathing rate drop substantially, and your body truly is in deep sleep rest mode. This is the restorative sleep that people need in order to function well in life. So we'll talk about how not all sleep is created equal. You might feel like you slept all night, but then sometimes you wake up and you feel all grouchy and restless and not rested. And if that's the case, your body may have never made it all the way down into those deep stages of sleep. So kind of a big concept here is that you really need to spend a good amount of time in that delta sleep during the night to feel truly rested and ready to go. And then, of course, we talked about REM sleep already. Okay, so here's just kind of a visual of how your brainwaves change as you cycle into and out of these different stages of sleep. And now here's another visual about what's actually happening in your body during the night as you sleep the whole night through. So we just said that all sleep isn't created equal. And a big idea is that as you sleep during the night, you go through these 90-minute sleep cycles predictably over and over and over again, until you wake up in the morning. And so let's compare what young adults do to what older adults do here. If you look up at the very top visual there, obviously you start out awake, you immediately go all the way from waking consciousness into non-REM 1, non-REM 2, non-REM 3, and now you're going to stay here for about 30 minutes, like we just realized, but you don't stay there all night long. Eventually, your brainwaves start to cycle back up through 2, One, but you don't wake up. Now you go into your first REM stage of sleep for the night. This is where you're actively dreaming. Stay there for a little while, and then you go back down through 2, down to the delta waves. Then you cycle back up into the REM. Then you cycle back down. Then you cycle back up. And so you continue to go through that process throughout the night. So really at any given point in time, if someone were to come into your room and try to wake you, again, you're really easily woken up during those more shallow stages of sleep. You're nearly impossible to wake up in the deepest stage of sleep. You're totally unresponsive. Your mom could come in your room, flip the light on, start yelling things at you, and you literally wouldn't even register because you're that disconnected from reality. Take a look at those different pictures for a minute and try to see if you notice any major differences between the sleep cycle patterns of young adults versus older adults. And one thing you'll probably notice is that older adults spend less time in that deep restorative type of sleep than younger adults do, which is a bummer for them. And you'll also notice that in both categories, as the night goes on, the amount of time that you spend in that REM stage of sleep increases. So you dream for longer periods of time throughout the night. And eventually, when you wake up in the morning, you're waking up out of that very last REM stage of sleep that you would have experienced. So that's kind of the gist behind sleep stages and the cycles that you move into and out of during a given night. Okay. Sleep is crucial to our survival and to our development. We know that sleeping allows our brain to clean out toxins, to restore our body, to process information, to help regulate our mood, to strengthen our immune system, and all of those things. And we also believe that dreaming is essential. So we'll talk about that in a second. But just to show you kind of the negative effects on your body when you don't get enough sleep. And sadly, probably all of us in our class have experienced moments of sleep deprivation or seasons of life when we're not getting the best sleep. But I'm going to just be quiet here and I'm going to give you a moment to kind of skim through what you see there in terms of all the different parts of your body that are impacted when you're not getting enough sleep. So take a minute and just check those out. I think one thing that I would love to highlight for you is the impact of sleep deprivation on cognition. So they've done some really powerful studies that show that if you're severely sleep deprived, you operate motor vehicles in a far less safe way, nearly to the point of mimicking drunk drivers and the way that they drive. It can impair your motor functioning that much. So super important for your mental health and for your physical health to get enough sleep whenever possible. Okay, why do psychologists think that we also need to dream? Because in sleep studies where they deprive people of the REM stage of sleep, so this is mean, and this is accomplished basically if you go spend the night in a sleep lab. Obviously, you're sleeping during the night, and psychologists are reading the EEG output that's coming from your brain. They'll do studies where every time someone's brain goes into the REM stage of sleep, they purposefully wake them up and they won't let them stay in that REM stage. Then the next night, when they're able to sleep as long as they want to without being bothered, they spend way more amount of time in the REM stage of sleep than a typical sleeper would. And so they think that's the body's way of, for some reason, trying to recover that type of sleep in particular, not just sleep in general. We'll revisit this in class because there's a huge confounding variable involved with what I just told you. And so we'll see what you think about that next time. But basically, REM rebound is the lengthening and increasing frequency and depth of rapid eye movement sleep, which occurs after periods of sleep deprivation. So when people have been prevented from experiencing REM, they take less time than usual to get into the REM state, and then they stay in that state for longer periods of time than usual as well. Okay, let's talk about sleep disorders. And you may have experienced insomnia in particular, if we look at the sleep disorders listed here. But insomnia is persistent problems either in the ability to fall asleep or in the ability to stay asleep during the night. Okay. Narcolepsy is fascinating. It affects a very tiny percentage of the population. And this is where you're just walking around doing your day in normal waking consciousness. And all of a sudden, your brain just flips itself into REM sleep without any warning whatsoever. Your body then becomes voluntarily paralyzed and you're functionally just asleep. So we will talk more about that. I'm going to show you an amazing video of Skeeter, the narcoleptic poodle. Animals can suffer from narcolepsy as well. So we'll unpack that a little bit together in class next time. And then another way more common sleep disorder is sleep apnea. And this is where people fall asleep during the night and they intermittently stop breathing during sleep, which obviously is not functional. And so your body wakes itself up so that you'll start to breathe again. But this happens over and over and over again throughout the night so that the person never really gets to enter those deep restorative sleep stages. You might know some people with sleep apnea. It tends to overly affect overweight older men. So lots of people's dads in my classes in the past have dealt with sleep apnea. And so we can talk about a common treatment for that next time. But typically you can get a sleep mask and you plug it into the wall and it helps breathe for you so that your body doesn't continually wake yourself up during the night. Okay, a couple other things to mention. We've already mentioned sleep paralysis and REM behavior disorder. But again, sleep paralysis, this is functionally a positive thing, but it can go haywire every once in a while. So sleep paralysis is when you go into the REM stage of sleeping. Now you're dreaming. And so it's good that your body paralyzes itself so that you can't get up and act out your dreams and hurt yourself in any particular way. However, sometimes you wake up during your REM stage of sleep and that mechanism doesn't switch over quite in time. And so people have experienced like laying there in the bed awake, but they can't move. And they literally functionally can't because their brain hasn't switched over yet. And so it can feel terrifying, when you wake up and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't move my body. And then eventually that mechanism typically goes into, switches into gear in your brain. But if that's happening regularly to you, there's things you can do. Go to the doctor and they have some things that they can help you with. REM behavior disorder, then, this is the opposite. So this is where you don't voluntarily paralyze yourself during that REM stage of sleep. And so you are getting up and acting out your dreams and doing other types of things like that. I watched this Oprah episode one time where a wife woke up and her husband was just running around the house. He must have been having a dream that he was in battle and he had climbed underneath their kitchen table and he was yelling and he's like, don't come near me. And she tried to come near him to wake him up and he ended up punching her in the face. And it was a whole situation. So this can be very dangerous. And they do actually say, don't ever try to wake up someone who's sleepwalking or sleep talking because they're not aware enough to take anybody else's feelings or welfare into account. They're just acting. And so you can be in danger if you try to do those types of things. Okay. And then one other thing related to sleep that's kind of interesting, and I'm excited to hear all of your stories. You probably have some stories, unfortunately, about night terrors or sleepwalking or talking that we can share in class next time. But night terrors, these tend to happen in that deep, deep stage of sleep. And it's different than a nightmare. So night terrors tend to be incredibly vivid and real. And because they're happening in a non-REM stage of sleep, children can get up and act out their dreams. They can sleepwalk, sleep talk, those types of things. And again, it's not advised to try to wake them up. It is advised to try to navigate them back into their bed and try to get them to go back to sleep. So those are kind of just some sleep abnormalities or sleep disorders that are common that psychologists are interested in. Okay, and then last little topic, and we'll talk more about this in class next time, is dreaming. So typically we all dream 4 to 5 times a night. Every time we go into that REM stage of sleep, we are actively dreaming. But if you ask a lot of people, they'll tell you, no, I don't dream at all. But really they do, they just don't remember dreaming. So there's individual differences in terms of whether people remember their dreams or not. Regardless of that though, all human brains tend to dream about 4 to 5 times a night. And so dreams are really just images, emotions, and thoughts that are passing through a sleeping person's mind. Um, there is this phenomenon called vivid recall, sorry, where if you're awakened during the last little bit of your REM sleep or directly after, you tend to remember your dreams the best and sometimes even really vividly. So, psychologists do suggest that if you're someone who never remembers your dreams and you're kind of interested in doing that, if you want to, if you set your alarm for 10 minutes earlier than you typically do, you should be waking yourself up out of that last REM stage of sleep during the night. And then you can maybe keep a notepad next to your bed and write down as much as you can remember of your dreams. Because if you don't continue to think about it, it's elusive, right? It kind of floats away. So a little pro tip, if you're interested in remembering your dreams, that's something that you can do. So we talked about what a dream is. Why do we dream? There are competing theories out there. Some are less scientific than others. And so we're going to look at the least scientific dream theory first, and then I'll show you two other ones on the next slide, and then we will be done with this portion of our content. But one really popular old school theory related to dreams stems out of the psychoanalytic, psychodynamic school of thought way back in the day with Sigmund Freud. And if you remember, Freud was all about how, as human beings, we shove any negative energy or urges or things that have happened to us way down into our unconscious where we're not consciously aware of it, but it somehow slips back up to influence our lives. And one way that Freud thought unconscious issues slipped back up to influence our lives was through dreams. So Freud really viewed dreams as a mechanism for wish fulfillment or an outlet for otherwise unacceptable feelings. And he distinguished between manifest content, which is like the surface level content of a dream, what's actually happening, versus latent content or the underlying deeper disturbed meaning behind a dream. So for instance, Freud might say that, okay, so let's say that I'm dating someone and we break up. And I am truly devastated. I'm upset. This person has wronged me. I can't stand them right now. Freud might say, well, really deep down, latently, that I might want to really hurt them or harm them in some way. But that's not really acceptable, right, for me to think about or spend a lot of mental energy on. And so, maybe I try to dismiss those feelings because I don't feel like they're appropriate. But then when I'm dreaming, I might have a dream where I'm walking along the side of the road with my ex-boyfriend and a bus pulls up and he gets on the bus and I wave goodbye to him. Freud might say that that manifest content of that dream, me putting my boyfriend onto a bus and waving him goodbye, might be some sort of hidden symbol for some deeper, disturbed, underlying latent content that I might feel toward him, like I want him totally out of my life or gone from the earth or hurt or harmed or whatever I might be trying to shove down in my unconscious. So that's just one example of the difference between manifest versus latent content that they might ask you about related to Freud's theory. So Freud, when he talked about doing therapy to help people, was all about dream analysis. He wrote this really intense manual that was supposed to explain to people what different things meant in dreams. So for instance, like if you've ever had a dream where your teeth fell out, then that means you're really stressed about something, or so on and so forth. There's absolutely zero scientific evidence to back up this theory whatsoever. It's completely untestable. And so people don't give it a lot of weight in the scientific community, but other people that are just kind of interested, they're really interesting books that he wrote. If you ever want to look a little bit more into it, definitely not scientifically proven in any way, shape, or form. So that's Freud's theory. He called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. Let's contrast that with other super scientific explanations for why we dream. So we're going to look at the information processing theory, and then we'll look at the activation synthesis theory. The information processing theory basically says that dreams serve a physiological function for us, which is that they help us sort out the day's events and consolidate our memories. So psychologists who promote the information processing model of dreaming, they basically kind of say that sleep is a way for your brain to clean house. It organizes things that you've learned throughout the day. It gets rid of things that it doesn't think you need to hold on to. And those types of things. Okay. Activation synthesis theory is a cognitive developmental theory, and it says that REM sleep triggers impulses that evoke kind of random visual memories, which our sleeping brain weaves into stories. And so the dream content reflects the dreamer's cognitive development related to his or her knowledge and understanding. It basically says that as you're dreaming, different parts of your brain are producing images or sounds or other things like that. And to make sense of it, since there's no input to go along with those neural firings, your brain just makes up stories and puts them together. Really, probably the most scientifically grounded theory is that information processing theory. So we can talk about some studies next time that lend credence to that one in particular. And that's what I've got for you around different levels of consciousness this time. We will go ahead and review together more in class next time, and I look forward to seeing you then.